November 1945, a city in ruins, streets still blocked by rubble, buildings reduced to hollow facades, the smell of ash and turned earth lingering in the cold Bavarian air. Nuremberg was, literally, a corpse of a city. And yet, in the only functional building left standing amid that devastation, the Palace of Justice, hastily reinforced with simultaneous translation cables newly run along its walls, 22 men sat in the defendant's dock. They had guards behind them. They had microphones in front of them. They had headphones transmitting in 4 languages, and they had something no criminal leader of that magnitude had ever had before: the obligation to listen, point by point, to everything they had done. What was revealed in that room between November 20th, 1945 and October 1st, 1946 was not a list of deaths. It was the complete architecture of an organized cruelty.
Que la veille, n'ayant pas assez de gaz, ils avaient jeté les enfants vivants dans les fournaises.
Medical experiments executed on living prisoners, mobile extermination units with weekly quotas, mass deportations designed as deferred death sentences, camps that were not camps but machines. This is the account of what was presented in Nuremberg, of the evidence, the testimonies, the films, the confessions, of the moment when the world had to look without turning its eyes away. To understand what Nuremberg was, one must first understand what the name represented. Nuremberg had been the sacred city of Nazism. It was there that the Parteitagen were held, the annual congresses of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, those massive rallies where Adolf Hitler would step onto the podium at the Zeppelin Field and deliver his speeches before tens of thousands of followers. It was the city where, in September 1935, the Nuremberg laws had been promulgated, which deprived German Jews of citizenship and declared them, in legal terms, beings of an inferior rank. Choosing Nuremberg for the trial was not accidental. It was a statement. The building chosen was the Justizpalast, the Palace of Justice. It had survived relatively intact through the Allied bombings of January and March 1945, when the Royal Air Force reduced almost 90% of the city's historic centre to rubble. Room 600 on the 4th floor was transformed into a judicial arena. The architects of the United States Office of Strategic Services, led by Officer Daniel Kiley, worked for weeks to prepare the space: galleries for the public, translation booths, a system of microphones, and motion picture and still cameras in fixed positions. The resulting space was approximately 23 meters long by 16 meters wide. It was smaller than foreign correspondents expected. The process that began in that room was, from its conception, unprecedented. Never before had a tribunal of this nature existed. Never before had the leaders of a state been tried for having planned and unleashed an aggressive war, for having ordered war crimes, or for having executed crimes against humanity. The legal concept itself had to be built from scratch. The initial idea emerged in September 1944 in the small office of a United States War Department colonel named Murray Bernays, located on the 3rd floor of a building on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. Bernays, a graduate of Harvard and Columbia Law School, the son of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants and a nephew-in-law of Sigmund Freud — he had adopted his wife's surname — had been working for weeks with barely any sleep. The order he had received was formidable and vague at the same time: to invent the legal machinery to bring war criminals to justice. Bernays' solution, set down in just 6 pages classified as top secret, was elegant in its structure. The Nazi regime was to be declared a criminal conspiracy. If the entire machinery of the state was criminal in itself, then its creators and executors were too, by the simple fact of having belonged to it and directed its operations. This allowed 2 things simultaneously: to catch the major planners, who rarely dirtied their own hands, and to declare entire organizations like the SS, the Gestapo, or the Reich Security Service as criminal. President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9547 on May 2, 1945, appointing Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson as the representative and chief prosecutor for the United States. Jackson was a man of a solid, banker-like appearance, dark blue suit, a watch chain crossing just the suggestion of a belly, born in Jamestown, New York, without a university degree in law, but with a mind that his colleagues described as a trap that never failed. He was bored on the Supreme Court, and he knew it. This mission was something different. The London Agreement, signed on August 8, 1945 by the United States, the United Kingdom, France and the Soviet Union, established the Charter of the International Military Tribunal. 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The tribunal would have 8 judges, 4 members and 4 alternates, 1 from each Allied power. The British member, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, was designated as president. The 22 defendants arrived in Nuremberg in October 1945. They were escorted one by one to individual cells in Block C of the prison adjacent to the Palace of Justice. The cells measured approximately 4 meters long by 2 meters wide. They had a wooden bunk, a folding table, a chair and a toilet without a lid. The electric light bulb remained turned on all night. The guards, soldiers from the 6,850, the Internal Security Detachment, had instructions to observe the prisoners through a small window in the door every 30 seconds. The prison commander was Colonel Burton C. Andrus, a man with a square jaw and a polished helmet who treated his prisoners with a meticulous coldness. Andrus's concern was not the emotional well-being of the defendants. It was that they lived long enough to sit in the dock and face the charges. Robert Ley, head of the German Labour Front, made that concern impossible on October 25, 1945, 11 days before the trial began. Ley made himself a rope from the frayed edges of an army towel, tied it to the toilet pipe, and strangled himself. He was the first. He would not be the other. On November 20, 1945, at 10 o'clock in the morning, room 600 was full. 250 accredited journalists, delegations from the 4 Allied countries, observers from 19 nations, and in the dock, arranged in 2 rows of 11, those who remained of the original 22 defendants. Robert Ley had died, plus the notable absence of Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, whose whereabouts were unknown and who would be tried in absentia. Hermann Wilhelm Göring occupied the first seat in the front row, as befitted his rank of Reichsmarschall, the only one with that title in the entire history of the Reich. He was 52 years old. He had lost about 40 kilograms from what he dragged around during the final years of the regime, partly due to the forced elimination of the paracodeine he consumed at a rate of dozens of pills a day. Even so, he remained stout, broad-faced, with blue eyes that observed the room with a mixture of calculated disdain and fascination. He was, by any measure used, the most intelligent, the most charismatic, and the most dangerous defendant. His intelligence quotient, according to the tests by prison psychologist Gustav M. Gilbert, reached 138 points. He ruled the defendant's dock with an informal but undisputed authority. Next to him, Rudolf Hess, the former number 3 of the party, the man who had flown to Scotland solo in May 1941 with the absurd hope of negotiating peace, sat with his eyes sunken and his gaze lost in the void. Hess had spent years feigning, or suffering from, the doctors never determined it with absolute certainty, total amnesia. When the prison officials handed him the indictment and asked him to write his reaction, he wrote in English the words, "I can't remember." That was the only thing he could or wanted to say. In the second row, Wilhelm Keitel, Field Marshal and Chief of the General Staff of the High Command of the German Armed Forces. He was what people expected of a Prussian general, slender, rigid, his chin always slightly elevated. His defense during the trial would reduce to a single line that he had already written on the indictment. For a soldier, an order is an order. It was a phrase that would cost him his life. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, second in the SS hierarchy after Heinrich Himmler, who had committed suicide in May 1945. Kaltenbrunner stood nearly 2 meters tall, his face marked by university dueling scars with broad cheekbones and eyes that several foreign correspondents described as bottomless eyes. He was what people imagined when thinking of an SS criminal. A headline from a North American tabloid newspaper, which a guard had shown to Kaltenbrunner shortly after his capture in Altaussee, Austria, in May 1945, proclaimed, "Gas chamber expert captured." Kaltenbrunner turned, according to several accounts, mortally pale. Hans Frank, Hitler's personal lawyer and Governor-General of occupied Poland from October 1939 to January 1945. The man who had administered the largest extermination laboratory in history from the Wawel Royal Castle in Krakow, playing Chopin in his private rooms and signing death decrees at dawn. Frank had attempted suicide in the days immediately following his capture, cutting his wrists with a garden knife he had obtained in the Miesbach jail in Bavaria. Before arriving there, combat soldiers from the 36th Regiment of the 7th Army, men who days earlier had passed through the Dachau concentration camp, had forced him to run through a double line 70 feet long while they beat and kicked him until he fell. They picked him up. They pushed him forward again. Julius Streicher, editor and founder of the anti-Semitic weekly Der Stürmer, was the most despised among the defendants themselves. His companions in the dock did not want to be seen in his company. The psychologist Gilbert noted that Streicher obtained the lowest intelligence quotient of all the defendants on the standard psychological tests. A psychiatric commission made up of Dr. Krasnushkin from Moscow, Colonel Schroeder from Chicago, and Dr. Delay from Paris examined him to determine if he suffered from a psychosis. When the doctors asked him to undress for the physical examination, Streicher looked at the Russian female interpreter present and threw a sexually charged remark at her. The woman turned toward the wall. Streicher was, in the description of his own defense lawyer, a man whose anti-Semitic obsession might originate in a diseased mind. He was not declared psychotic, only disturbed. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, the architect who had designed the monumental settings for the party congresses and who had managed a system of slave labor that moved millions of people across occupied Europe. Speer was visually different from the rest, 39 years old, with regular and aristocratic features, and with the calm attitude of someone who had decided before the trial began that the best strategy was calculated contrition. He was the only defendant who responded to the question about the indictment with a phrase that implied collective responsibility. The trial is necessary. There is a common responsibility for such horrendous crimes, even in an authoritarian system. On November 21, 1945, Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson stood before the tribunal to deliver the opening statement for the American prosecution. What Jackson said during those hours remained recorded in the trial transcripts and in the memory of those who heard it. It was a speech of extraordinary precision, built upon a legal premise that in 1945 was still radical, that countries and their leaders could be tried for crimes committed against people who were not their citizens in the name of an international law that was still being defined at that very moment. But beyond the legal arguments, what determined the direction of the proceedings was a prosecutorial strategy that the prosecutors of the four powers had agreed upon during the summer negotiations, to build the case primarily on documents captured from the Nazi apparatus itself. This was deliberate. The Germans had documented their own crimes with a bureaucratic thoroughness that in retrospect is difficult to comprehend. Minutes of meetings, signed directives, extermination statistics, situation reports, internal correspondence, official diaries. When the Allied armies advanced into Germany in the early months of 1945, they found entire archives that no official had had time to destroy. Hans Frank, the governor of Poland, had ordered for years that everything he said, in public or in private, in his office or at receptions, be transcribed and archived. His official diary occupied 42 volumes bound in red and grey, totaling 11,367 pages. Frank took them with him when he fled Krakow in January 1945 before the advance of the Red Army. When he was captured, the diary was still in his luggage. The United States prosecutors, led by Colonel Robert Story in the documentation department, had gathered hundreds of thousands of pages of captured archives. The task of organizing, translating, and selecting the most relevant ones occupied a team of researchers for weeks. Many of those pages revealed something that the prosecutors had suspected but whose scale exceeded any expectation. The Nazi regime had created a system to record in writing every step of its crimes. The directive of October 18, 1942, signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and authorized by Adolf Hitler, ordered that all members of Allied commando units, even when traveling in uniform and whether armed or unarmed, were to be slaughtered to the last man even if they attempted to surrender. It stated literally that those commandos who fell into the hands of military authorities after having first been captured by the civil police were to be handed over immediately to the Sicherheitsdienst. That order was executed in Norway, France, Czechoslovakia, and Italy. Men in uniform, legal prisoners of war by definition, were executed on the spot or transported to concentration camps without any legal process. The decree of July 1941, signed by Reinecker, chief of the Prisoners of War Department of the High Command, established the treatment of Soviet prisoners with a ferocity that transcended even the norms of brutality of conventional warfare. The text was explicit. The Bolshevik soldier has lost his right to be treated as an honorable opponent in accordance with the Geneva Convention. It was ordered that any sign of insubordination, active or passive, be broken immediately by force of arms, and it added, "He who carries out the order and does not use his weapons or does so with insufficient energy is punishable." Soviet prisoners of war died by the millions in German camps. They died of hunger, of cold, of thirst, of untreated diseases. A report written by Alfred Rosenberg himself, Reichsminister for the occupied Eastern Territories and addressed to Field Marshal Keitel on February 28, 1942, described the situation with a frankness that its authors probably never imagined would be read in an international court. The letter mentioned that the instructions forbade the civilian population from giving food to the prisoners and that they have let them starve to death. That in numerous camps no shelter was provided at all. That exhausted prisoners, unable to stay on their feet during the marches, were shot before the eyes of the horrified population and the corpses were abandoned. That was signed, with name and title. There are documents that, when read aloud, stop the breath of a room. On January 3, 1946, Colonel John Harlan Amen approached the prosecutor's podium with the intention of questioning a witness. The witness was Otto Ohlendorf, general of the SS and commander of Einsatzgruppe D between June 1941 and June 1942. The Einsatzgruppen were, in organizational terms, mobile units of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS security service, deployed behind the front lines in the east with the mission of identifying and eliminating political and racial enemies of the Reich. In practice, they were death squads. 4 main groups, A, B, C, and D, operated behind the German advance in the Soviet Union starting in June 1941. Their situation reports, discovered in the captured archives, described the results of their operations with weekly statistics. They were bureaucratic reports with the same tone as weather forecasts. Ohlendorf had come to occupy that position in a way that Whitney Harris, the American prosecutor who had questioned him initially, found perversely ironic. Ohlendorf was an economist with a university education from the universities of Göttingen and Leipzig, with a degree in law. He had started in the Sicherheitsdienst as an economic intelligence agent, but he had committed the error of complaining to Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler about the mass killings of Jews in Poland. Himmler concluded that Ohlendorf was clearly a product of too much education. With exquisite malice, he assigned him command of Einsatzgruppe D. Harris during the pre-trial interrogation had begun with routine questions, date of birth, place of origin, assignments in the Sicherheitsdienst. One answer aroused his curiosity. Ohlendorf mentioned that he had spent a year in command of Einsatzgruppe D. Knowing the murderous reputation of those units, Harris threw out a direct question. "How many people did you kill?" The answer, delivered without visible emotional inflection, left him paralyzed. In room 600, Colonel Amen formulated the question for the official record of the tribunal. Ohlendorf replied, "In the year between June 1941 and June 1942, the troops of the Einsatz reported 90,000 people liquidated. Men, women, and children?" asked Amen. "Yes. Was mass shooting the only method of execution?" "No. Reichsführer Himmler," Ohlendorf explained with the same calmness with which he might describe an administrative process, had observed that the shootings of women and children imposed a terrible psychological burden on the personnel, especially on men with families. Therefore, starting in 1942, women and children were gassed in airtight vans. The vans were ordinary, closed vehicles with the exhaust pipe redirected into the interior of the cargo compartment. How many men did it take to kill 90,000 people? Einsatzgruppe D had a force of 500 men. In the defendant's dock, Walter Funk closed his eyes as Ohlendorf began to describe the procedures following the executions. The jewelry and gold of the victims were sent to the Reich Ministry of Finance. What followed was equally revealing, but for different reasons. The defense lawyers, during the turn for cross-examination, tried to make Ohlendorf admit that Ernst Kaltenbrunner had no direct authority over the concentration camps. Kaltenbrunner was the chief of the RSHA, the agency that grouped together the Gestapo, the SD, and the criminal police. Kaltenbrunner's lawyer, Kurt Kaufmann, argued that the extermination orders went from Himmler directly to the chief of the Gestapo, Heinrich Müller, bypassing Kaltenbrunner. Ohlendorf responded that Kaltenbrunner was directly in the chain of command. He was Müller's superior, so he could relay orders from Himmler or initiate his own. Kaufmann had committed the classic mistake of cross-examination, asking a question without knowing the answer beforehand. But the strangest moment, the one that no attendee in room 600 would forget for decades, came when a different defense lawyer, Ludwig Babel, in charge of the defense of the SS as an organization, 64 years old, visibly shaken by the description he had heard, felt compelled to ask a question that no prosecutor had asked. "Did you have no scruples regarding the nature of those orders?" "Yes, of course," Ohlendorf replied. "Then how was it that you carried them out?" Ohlendorf appeared surprised by the question. "Because it is inconceivable to me that a subordinate should not obey orders given by the leaders of the state." Babel looked at the witness for a long moment. Then he sat down without saying anything more. 2 days after Ohlendorf's testimony, prosecutor Smith Bruckhardt called another member of the SS to the stand. Dieter Wisliceny, a former direct collaborator of Adolf Eichmann and head of Department 1V A4 of the RSHA, the section in charge of Jewish affairs, Wisliceny testified that in August 1942 he had gone to see Eichmann with an urgent question. The Slovak authorities were pressuring him to find out what had happened to 17,000 of their Jewish citizens deported to Poland. They wanted to visit them, to know how they were. Eichmann, after several evasions, finally admitted that such a visit was impossible. The deportees were dead. "How was that possible?" Wisliceny asked. Eichmann opened the safe in his office and took out a document. He showed him the order. The extermination of the Jews was official policy, transmitted from the Führer to Himmler and from Himmler to the RSHA. Wisliceny declared that that was the first time he had heard mention of the final solution. Bruckhardt then asked about the state of knowledge and participation of Kaltenbrunner, who had taken command of the RSHA in January 1943 following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in Prague. Was there any change in the extermination policy under the direction of Kaltenbrunner? There was no decrease or change of any kind, Wisliceny responded. Did Kaltenbrunner know Eichmann personally, the man directly responsible for the final solution? There was no doubt. Kaltenbrunner and Eichmann were Austrian compatriots. Kaltenbrunner's father had been the lawyer for the electricity company managed by Eichmann's father. The two sons had gone to the same school. When Kaltenbrunner summoned his RSHA staff in Berlin, Wisliceny recalled, he always greeted Eichmann with particular warmth, asking about his wife and his children. Bruckhardt formulated his final question. Did Eichmann say anything on that occasion about the number of Jews who had been murdered? He said he would leap laughing into his grave, Wisliceny responded, because the feeling that he had 5 million people on his conscience would be for him a source of extraordinary satisfaction. In the dock, American magistrate Francis Biddle had written a question in the margin of a document, "Who is Eichmann?" He now had his answer. The tribunal also received the testimony of Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss, commander of the Auschwitz concentration and extermination camp between 1940 and 1943. Höss was not a defendant in this trial. He would be tried subsequently in Poland and executed in 1947 next to the camp facilities. But he appeared as a witness. His statement under oath before the International Military Tribunal, presented on April 15, 1946, described the Auschwitz system with a technical precision that several of the judges, seasoned by decades of criminal proceedings, declared they had never heard anything like before. Höss declared that approximately 2.5 million people had been murdered in Auschwitz during his period of command. The extermination process, he described, followed an established protocol. The trains arrived at the ramp. Those who arrived, Jews in their immense majority, deportees from all of occupied Europe, were selected on the ramp by SS doctors, principally to determine who could be assigned to forced labor. Those who did not pass the selection, the sick, the elderly, the children, mothers with small children, were led directly to the gas chambers camouflaged as shower facilities. The gas used was Zyklon B, a pesticide in granules that upon coming into contact with the air released hydrogen cyanide. Death by Zyklon B in a gas chamber was, according to the subsequent testimonies of the Sonderkommandos, the group of prisoners forced to work in the crematoria, a process that took between 3 and 15 minutes depending on the concentration of the gas and the number of people locked inside. The tribunal also heard the affidavit statement of Kurt Lindown, a Gestapo official, which described the screening teams deployed in the prisoner camps on the Eastern Front. Secret police commandos permanently assigned to the camps to segregate the prisoners of war who were candidates for execution and report them to the secret police office. In the Gross Rosen camp, the camp commander had sent a report on October 23, 1941, to Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo, listing the Soviet prisoners of war executed the day before. It was a routine report. Among the crimes that the tribunal examined in detail were the medical experiments performed on concentration camp prisoners. These experiments were known to the prosecutors before the trial began, but their scope and systematic nature exceeded what many had anticipated. In the Dachau concentration camp, located about 16 kilometers northwest of Munich, experiments were performed starting in 1941 and 1942, which the International Military Tribunal itself, in its judgment of October 1, 1946, described as being of the most cruel and inhuman type. The main Nuremberg trial mentioned them in the context of the crimes of the SS and the RSHA. The doctors specifically responsible would be tried in the separate trial against Nazi doctors that began in December 1946. The Dachau hypothermia experiments, documented in the captured archives and presented before the tribunal, followed a precise protocol. In August 1942, the date is documented in the archives of the Ahnenerbe, the SS Scientific and Research Foundation that funded them. Prisoners from the camp were immersed in ice water in a bathtub or pool until their body temperature dropped to 28 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the human heart enters ventricular fibrillation and death ensues within minutes. In some experiments, the immersion was prolonged to measure the exact time necessary to induce death. The report by Dr. Sigmund Rasche, an SS officer and the person responsible for these experiments with the direct backing of Reichsführer SS Himmler, described the results with tables and graphs. The average survival time ranged between 50 and 80 minutes in water at 0 degrees. In parallel experiments, prisoners were placed in reduced pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions, with the objective of determining the physiological effects on pilots who underwent depressurization at great heights. Rasche's reports described the effects of decompression at simulated altitudes of between 12 and 21 kilometers. At those pressures, the nitrogen dissolved in the blood forms bubbles. Blood vessels burst. The pain before death, according to the reports, was extreme. Experiments with poisoned bullets, tested on prisoners to evaluate their effectiveness, and mass sterilization experiments using X-rays and other methods, designed with the stated objective of sterilizing the entire population of the Eastern Territories without the victims knowing it, also formed part of the evidence presented. Dr. Karl Klauberg, who directed sterilization experiments in Auschwitz-Birkenau, wrote to Himmler in 1943, affirming that with his method he could sterilize several hundred women a day with the help of one well-trained physician and 10 assistants. The judgment of the tribunal recorded that the experiments on prisoners included immersions in ice water until death, experiments in low-pressure chambers, experiments to determine how long a human being could survive in freezing water, experiments with poisoned bullets, experiments with contagious diseases, and experiments for the sterilization of men and women using X-rays and other methods. The tribunal's conclusion on the SS as an organization was unequivocal. The SS was enabled to obtain a grant of government funds for this type of research on the basis that it had access to human material not available to other agencies. There it was, written in the judgment. Human beings were called material. On November 29, 1945, 9 days after the trial opened, one of the most extraordinary moments of the entire process occurred. The prison psychologist Gustav M. Gilbert and the psychiatrist Douglas Kelly placed themselves at the opposite ends of the defendant's dock. They carried notebooks. They had orders to observe and record. At the podium, Commander William Donovan, the Wild Bill Donovan, who had founded the Office of Strategic Services, announced the projection of a documentary film about the Nazi concentration camps, just as they had been found by the American troops. The film was titled Nazi Concentration Camps, and had been assembled with footage filmed directly in Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald and other camps following their liberation in the spring of 1945. The lights in room 600 were turned off. Gilbert took notes in real time at intervals of 1 or 2 minutes. Hjalmar Schacht, former president of the Reichsbank, refused to be forced to look at the film when Gilbert asked him to move so that he could sit better. He crossed his arms and turned his gaze toward the public galleries. The film began with images of prisoners being burned alive in a barn. Hans Fritzsche, head of radio operations in the Ministry of Propaganda, who had not yet seen any part of the film before that session, remained motionless, pale, with his lips tightly pressed together as he watched the opening. Wilhelm Keitel removed his translation headphones and wiped his forehead. Rudolf Hess stared at the screen with wild, sunken eyes, with the expression Gilbert noted of a ghost. Konstantin von Neurath, the former German foreign minister from the years prior to the Nazi regime and later protector of Bohemia and Moravia, bowed his head. He did not look. Walter Funk covered his eyes with his hands. He appeared to be in agony. He shook his head. Joachim von Ribbentrop, former foreign minister, closed his eyes and wiped the sweat from his face. Fritz Sauckel, the person responsible for slave labor, wiped his forehead with his handkerchief. Hans Frank, in his seat, blinked and swallowed repeatedly. He tried to hold back his tears. He murmured, "Horrible." Alfred Rosenberg, the official philosopher of Nazism and minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, shifted in his seat and glanced sideways at the screen, then hung his head, then looked to see how the others were reacting. Albert Speer looked very sad. He swallowed repeatedly. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, Nazi commissioner for the Netherlands, remained impassive throughout the entire projection. Franz von Papen, the man who had been Chancellor of Germany before Hitler, sat with his hand over his forehead looking downward. Goering leaned on the handrail of the dock. Most of the time he did not look at the screen. When he did look, he had an expression of sleepiness. Julius Streicher remained motionless, looking at the screen, barely blinking. The defense lawyers in their seats in front of the dock murmured. One said in an audible whisper, "For God's sake, it is terrible." When the lights came back on, that room was not the same as when they had been turned off. No one spoke for a moment. That night, Gilbert toured the cells. Goering, with whom he held the longest conversation, admitted that the images had been bad. "But that matter of the People's Court," he said, referring to a sequence in which Judge Roland Freisler, the president of the Volksgerichtshof who had presided over the summary trials of the conspirators from the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, yelled at the defendants in a hysterical manner during the proceedings, "That really made me squirm with shame." There was more that disturbed him about that footage than he was willing to admit. On December 11, 1945, prosecutor Thomas J. Dodd stood up to present the case against the Reich's slave labor program. Dodd was known in Nuremberg for his facility as a speaker rather than for his legal depth. His more erudite colleagues accused him of building his arguments on the research work of others. But in the courtroom he had a presence and a diction that held attention. That day, he demonstrated why he was there. He read into the tribunal record document 294 PS, a report written by Alfred Rosenberg himself to Fritz Sauckel, the plenipotentiary for labor deployment. The text described how a forced recruitment directive had been executed in the Soviet Union. "You cannot imagine the bestiality," Rosenberg had written to Sauckel. The German militia had arrived in a village to recruit workers. No one showed up. The soldiers began to set fire to houses. The civilians who ran to put out the fire were forbidden from doing so. They were beaten with rubber clubs and arrested. The imprisoned workers were locked in the village school. They cannot even go out to relieve themselves, but have to do it like pigs in the same room. Among them are lame, blind, and elderly people. We are now hunting human beings like dog catchers used to hunt dogs. Fritz Sauckel listened to this from the dock with a face of genuine perplexity. The man who had forcibly recruited, according to estimates by the tribunal, more than 5 million workers from the occupied territories of Europe, had difficulty understanding why he was being tried. He considered himself a man of the people, a former sailor and worker who had risen through the party thanks to his constancy and his hard work. His instructions, given directly by Hitler in March 1942 in the Reich Chancellery, had been explicit: to get 1.6 million foreign workers in 3 months. If volunteers did not present themselves, recruit them by force. Sauckel's archives, presented as evidence, showed that during the war more than 5 million forced workers had been transported from the occupied territories to Germany. The working conditions, food levels, and treatment of these workers were regulated differently depending on their racial origin. Soviet and Polish workers were subject to the most extreme conditions, with caloric rations insufficient to sustain intense physical labor and without legal protection of any kind. According to the records of the armaments factories where they worked, thousands died each month. The judgment of the tribunal regarding the charge of war crimes and crimes against humanity in relation to slave labor established that civilian workers from the occupied territories had been deported to Germany for slave labor on a scale that had few, if any, precedents in the history of the world. Albert Speer and Fritz Sauckel had fought throughout the entire process, in the dock and during nighttime debate sessions in the dining hall, over who was responsible for what in that system. Speer had convinced Hitler to appoint Sauckel head of the labor program. Speer was the one who demanded the workers for his armaments industries. Sauckel was the one who obtained them by whatever method. Speer would argue to the end that he did not know the conditions under which those workers lived and died. The prosecutors presented documents that suggested something different, that Speer had personally inspected some facilities where forced workers lived and worked. The debate between the two defendants was not purely legal. There was something of animal survival in it. The London Charter that created the International Military Tribunal used the category of third degree as a reference to the interrogation methods that the Gestapo itself applied to civilian suspects. The tribunal received as evidence the order of June 12, 1942, published by the chief of the Gestapo, Heinrich Müller, with the authorization of the chief of the SIPO and the SD, at that moment Reinhard Heydrich, assassinated in Prague days later, which authorized the use of third-degree methods in interrogations. The order was surgically specific in its language. The third degree can, according to circumstances, consist of, among other methods, very simple diet, bread and water, hard bed, dark cell, sleep deprivation, strenuous exercise, also floggings. For more than 20 strokes, a doctor must be consulted. What was not in that text were the practices that did not need to be mentioned because they were already standard: the suspension of arms tied behind the back, the so-called stirrup position, which dislocated the shoulders, electrodes applied to the genitals and extremities, the repeated immersion of the head in water to the point of loss of consciousness, systematic blows to the ears that could produce rupture of the eardrum, the use of tools to fracture extremities. These practices were documented in testimonies of survivors who reached the tribunal, though the main trial of 1945 to 1946 focused principally on crimes committed on a systemic scale, not on the details of individual interrogations. The judgment of October 1, 1946, established, under the heading of murder and ill treatment of civilian population, that persons suspected of opposing the German occupation were arrested and, upon being arrested, were interrogated by the Gestapo and the SD in the most shameful manner. The phrase "most shameful manner" was the euphemism used by the judgment of a tribunal that had heard in detail what that meant. The testimony of Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, a survivor of Auschwitz and Ravensbrück and a member of the French resistance detained in 1942, was received by the tribunal on January 28, 1946. Vaillant-Couturier described with precision what she had seen in the camp: the arrivals of the trains, the selection on the ramp, the gas chambers, the work of the Sonderkommandos who removed the corpses. She described that when trains arrived with Hungarian Jews in the summer of 1944, the convoys were so frequent that the crematoria ovens did not have sufficient capacity and the corpses were burned in open pits next to the facilities. The smell, she said, was perceptible from kilometers away. When her testimony ended, the president of the tribunal, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, did something unusual in a judicial proceeding of that formality. He recessed the hearing for a few minutes before moving on to the next item. The courtroom needed to breathe. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was the only defendant who chose to deny almost everything frontally during the trial. This was bold, considering that the prosecution had documents signed by him. Kaltenbrunner had been the chief of the RSHA since January 1943, the agency that grouped together the Gestapo, the criminal police, the Sicherheitsdienst, and the Einsatzgruppen. Under his operational instructions, the concentration camps dependent on the WVHA the SS Economic Administrative Main Office, had functioned as death factories until the final days of the war. The final solution, in its most industrialized phase, from the Wannsee Conference of January 1942 to the evacuations of the camps in 1945, had passed in large measure through the bureaucracy he directed. Kaltenbrunner denied. He denied having ordered the execution of prisoners. He denied knowing the scope of the extermination of Jews. He denied having effective command over the operations of the camps. Those were the responsibilities of Himmler, of Müller, of Eichmann. He was an intelligence official. The prosecutors presented his signature. Kaltenbrunner's lawyer, Kurt Kaufmann, argued that those signatures corresponded to documents that had passed through his office by routine procedures, without Kaltenbrunner having knowledge of their real content. A woman ruined that defense. In the days immediately following the end of the war, in May 1945, a woman named Frau Plutz, an unemployed 33-year-old mother of one child whose husband was missing in action on the front, reported to the American Military Government Office in Nordhausen. She had been a typist at the Dora concentration camp, which depended on the Nordhausen complex. And one of her jobs had consisted of typing the death sentences issued against the prisoners. She remembered perfectly the signature that appeared on all those documents, Kaltenbrunner's signature. The organizational logic of the RSHA itself made Kaltenbrunner's defense impossible. Ohlendorf's testimony had confirmed that Kaltenbrunner was directly in the chain of command between Himmler and Müller. Eichmann's letters to Kaltenbrunner, captured in the archives, described the progress of the final solution with the frankness of someone reporting to a directly involved superior. From Budapest, in the summer of 1944, Eichmann personally supervised the deportation and extermination of 437,000 Hungarian Jews in less than 2 months. The trains left in convoys of between 44 and 48 sealed cattle cars. They arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The judgment of the tribunal established that, by late 1944, 400,000 Jews from Hungary had been murdered in Auschwitz. What the judgment also settled, following the evidence presented, was that Adolf Eichmann, whom Hitler had put in charge of this program, has estimated that the policy practiced resulted in the murder of 6 million Jews, of whom 4 million were murdered in the extermination institutions. 6 million, 4 of them in facilities designed specifically to kill them. While the trial advanced during the day, Gilbert toured the cells at night. His official job was to keep Colonel Andrus informed of the prisoner's state of mind. His real job, the one that occupied most of his mental energies, was to understand how the minds of those people worked. What he found in his night conversations with Göring was perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire process, not because of its revelations about concrete crimes, but because of what it revealed about the mechanics of power and self-deception. Göring was perfectly aware of what Einsatzgruppe D had done. He was perfectly aware of what the camps did. He had signed documents relating to the final solution. And yet, in his night conversations with Gilbert, he repeatedly insisted that he could not believe Hitler had personally ordered those killings. "It is a mystery, the whole thing," he would say, pacing the cell with his fists pressed against his forehead. "I keep thinking about it." It was a posture that Gilbert learned to read for what it was. Not ignorance, but a voluntary and strategic dissociation between the facts he himself knew and the narrative he wanted to project before history. Göring was, according to any reasonable psychological measurement, a man of extraordinary intelligence. And that made his rationalizations more elaborate than those of the rest, but no less rationalizations. In Hans Frank's cell, the tone was different. Frank had experienced, after his capture, something like a religious crisis. He had reconverted to Catholicism, with which he had broken to advance his career under atheist Nazism. Father Sixtus O'Connor, the Catholic chaplain of the prison, visited him regularly. Frank told Gilbert on several occasions that the trial was a world tribunal willed by God, destined to examine and put an end to the terrible era of suffering under Adolf Hitler, in his own words, written on the indictment. But on other nights, Frank returned to what had brought him there, to Lily Gao, the woman he had loved since his youth and whose family had rejected the young Frank for not being respectable enough, to his decades-long obsession with becoming someone respectable at any cost, to the way he had accepted signing decrees and closing his eyes to what happened in the camps because that was the price of his post, of his palace in Krakow, of his private train, of his dinners with Goebbels and with film actors. "When the war began, I made a pact with the devil to keep my position," he told Gilbert one night. He said it with the tone of someone who is still trying to understand how he got to where he got. Julius Streicher, for his part, never experienced any crisis or revision. In his conversations with Gilbert, Streicher kept explaining anti-Semitism as if it were a scientific doctrine that the rest of the world had not had the intelligence to understand. He described himself as the only man in the world who had clearly seen the Jewish problem as a historical problem. When the atrocities of the trial were presented before him, Streicher reframed them within his obsession. Everything was the fault of the Jews. The war was the fault of the Jews. The trial was the fault of the Jews. It was a triumph of world Jewry, he had written on the indictment. What Gilbert was building in his nights of conversations and in his observations in the courtroom was something more complex than a catalogue of monsters. What he found were men who had operated within a system that normalized every step toward crime and who had found ways to tell themselves stories that made that next step always seem justifiable, necessary, inevitable. The testimony of General Erich von Dembach-Zelewski, commander of the anti-partisan operations in the East, who appeared as a witness for the prosecution, added a piece to the puzzle that Gilbert had been assembling for weeks. Bach-Zelewski, who had supervised operations in which tens of thousands of civilians had been murdered under the label of anti-partisan, declared that for years Germans had been bombarded with propaganda that presented Slavs and Jews as subhumans, as corruptions of the race, as those responsible for Germany's misfortunes. Once that mental framework was installed, certain acts became possible for ordinary people who in other circumstances would never have committed them. Blind obedience and the dehumanization of the other. Two pieces that together could produce 90,000 dead in 12 months with 500 men. On January 7, 1946, Colonel Telford Taylor resumed the presentation of the case against the German High Command. Taylor was a man with the appearance of a poet in uniform, slender with wavy hair, with a protective air that some of his colleagues interpreted as distance, but his mastery of legal logic was first-rate. Taylor had taken the High Command case because practically no one else wanted it. The generals and admirals did not have the symbolic weight of Goering or the obvious vileness of Kaltenbrunner. Proving that military professionals who only conducted wars that politicians started were war criminals required reasoning that was more subtle and more difficult to communicate. Taylor read document 551 PS. It was the record of the Hossbach Conference of November 1937, where Hitler had laid out his plans for the aggressive territorial expansion of Germany to his generals, among them Blomberg, Fritsch, Raeder and Neurath. The generals present did not protest. They did not resign. They continued in their posts. Then Taylor read the commando order, signed by Field Marshal Keitel on October 18, 1942, which ordered the execution of captured members of Allied commando units, even in uniform. He read the case of General Anton Dostler, who had executed 15 OSS men captured in uniform during a mission in northern Italy in March 1944 in the area of La Spezia. Dostler had argued that he was only fulfilling the commando order signed by Keitel. He had been tried by an American military tribunal in Rome and executed the month prior to the start of Taylor's testimony. The question Taylor posed, and which the tribunal would take months to answer, was whether the chain of responsibility reached all the way to the men who signed those orders and those who transmitted them to the lower levels of command. Keitel, in his cell, spoke little with Gilbert. He was the most hermetic of all the defendants, with that Prussian rigidity that interpreted any emotional expression as a form of weakness. When Gilbert asked him his reaction to the commando order, Keitel responded that he had signed orders that gave German soldiers the right to do what they did, and that if those orders turned out now to be criminal, then he was responsible for them. It was the response of a man who had no defense other than honesty. On August 31, 1946, the defendants made their final personal statements before the tribunal. Goering spoke last among the defendants who intervened that day. He was the only one who did not apologize, did not beg, did not seek clemency. He spoke for an hour, rejecting all formal accusations and declaring that he had served his country with loyalty. His defense was coherent from the first to the last day of the proceedings. The victors have no moral right to judge the vanquished, and the Reichsmarshal was not willing to recognize that right. Hans Frank, before being interrupted by the tribunal which limited the time for statements, said that the proceedings were a world tribunal ordained by God. Keitel declared that a soldier has to obey, but that there are borders which the moral man cannot cross, even if he wears a uniform. It was the first time in the proceedings that Keitel publicly admitted something like that. On October 1st, 1946, the International Military Tribunal read its judgment in a session that lasted nearly 2 full days. 12 defendants were condemned to death by hanging: Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, Wilhelm Frick, Julius Streicher, Fritz Sauckel, Alfred Jodl, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, and Martin Bormann in absentia. 3 were acquitted: Franz von Papen, Hans Fritzsche, and Hjalmar Schacht. The others received prison sentences ranging between 10 years and life imprisonment. The judgment established with a clarity that left no room for interpretation that what had occurred under the Third Reich was not the occasional excesses of a brutal war, but a deliberate policy, planned and executed with bureaucratic methods on an industrial scale. The war crimes and crimes against humanity were not collateral consequences of the war. They were its partial objectives and its method of government. On October 16, 1946, between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning, the 11 remaining condemned to death, Bormann was absent, and it was already probable that he had died in the final days of Berlin, were executed in the gymnasium of the Palace of Justice of Nuremberg. The executioner was Master Sergeant John C. Woods, a 40-year-old veteran of the 3rd Division of the American Army, a man from Fort Leavenworth who had executed about 347 prisoners during his career. The gallows, 3 in total, were wooden platforms about 2.5 meters high with steps and trapdoors. The rope dropped about 2.5 meters. The order of execution was that of the dock, from left to right. First Ribbentrop, then Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Sauckel, Jodl, Seyss-Inquart. Göring never reached that room. Joachim von Ribbentrop was the first. He climbed the 13 steps of the platform at 1:11 in the morning. At the foot of the gallows, when they asked him if he had anything to say, he murmured, "God protect Germany." He fell through the trapdoor. The chronicles of the journalists present, a small group of Allied press representatives, described that the drop was not clean. The length of the rope, later analyzed, was insufficient to produce the instant cervical fracture that is death by technically executed hanging. Ribbentrop took 10 minutes to die. Keitel climbed with a firm step. His last words were, "Germany above all." He fell. Hans Frank climbed, smiling. He had spent his final weeks writing memoirs that he titled In the Shadow of the Gallows. He said, "I thank God for the grace that was granted to me in the final years of my life by knowing that I can return to my faith in the Lord." The trapdoor opened. Julius Streicher climbed shouting, "Heil Hitler," from the steps. When he saw the American Army photographers stationed in the room, he turned toward them and shouted, "Purim Fest 1946, a reference to the Jewish festival of Purim, which commemorates the defeat of the persecutors of the Jewish people before they put the hood on him. His last words, once with the rope around his neck, were directed to his wife. "Adele, my dear Adele." Fritz Sauckel climbed, crying, "I die innocent. The verdict is incorrect. God protect Germany and make her great." Kaltenbrunner, the 2-meter man who had presided over the machinery of extermination, climbed without saying anything clear. He murmured something about Austria. Hermann Göring never reached that room because he found a way not to arrive. At 10:40, on the night of October 15th, an hour and a half before the executions began, the guard who checked him every 30 seconds found the Reichsmarshal convulsing on his bunk. He died before the doctors arrived. He had his lips stained with a substance. A capsule of potassium cyanide had broken between his teeth. How he had obtained that capsule was the mystery that consumed Colonel Andrus for decades, literally decades, according to his own memoirs, and that was never completely resolved. Göring had been subjected to daily body searches. His cell had been examined. And yet, in his suicide note, Göring wrote that he had had the capsule with him since he was captured, hidden so well that despite all the searches it was not found. He had had with him, among his clothes or on his body for nearly a year and a half, the instrument of his last tactical victory. Andrus, according to subsequent testimonies, was so shattered by Göring's suicide that it took him weeks to recover emotionally. On October 1st, 1946, when Sir Geoffrey Lawrence finished reading the judgment, the International Military Tribunal had created something that did not exist before, an international legal precedent with the weight of jurisprudence. The judgment established 4 principles that passed into international legal history under the name of the Nuremberg Principles, subsequently adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1950. The first, any person who commits an act which constitutes a crime under international law is responsible therefore and liable to punishment. The second, the fact that internal law of a state does not impose a penalty for an act which constitutes a crime under international law does not relieve the person who committed the act from responsibility under international law. The third, the fact that a person who committed an act which constitutes a crime under international law acted as head of state or responsible government official does not relieve him from responsibility under international law. The fourth, and this was the one that caused the most controversy in the Western military tradition, the fact that a person acted pursuant to order of his government or of a superior does not relieve him from responsibility under international law, provided a moral choice was in fact possible to him. This last formulation was the exact reverse of what Keitel had written in his note regarding Admiral Canaris's memorandum. The objections arise from the military concept of chivalrous warfare. This is the destruction of an ideology, therefore I approve and back the measures. The Field Marshal had equated the destruction of an ideology with the torture and murder of millions of Soviet prisoners of war. The tribunal said that that was not a defense, it was a confession. The process did not resolve everything it intended to resolve. The tensions among the 4 Allied powers that operated as prosecutors, judges, and arbiters simultaneously were palpable from the first day. The presence of Soviet judges on a tribunal that tried aggression as a crime while the Soviet Union had invaded Finland in 1940 and signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany to divide up Poland was repeatedly pointed out as an insuperable moral contradiction. The defense attempted to introduce the tu quoque argument, you did the same thing, as a legal defense. The tribunal rejected it, that other criminals went unpunished was no reason to acquit the defendant. But the process did something that had not been done before. It forced the individuals with maximum responsibility for mass crimes to sit for months in front of the evidence of what they had ordered. It obliged them to listen in 4 languages to recordings of their own words, documents with their own signatures, and testimonies from the people who had survived their decisions. It subjected them to a process that, with all its imperfections, remained a process and not an execution in a prison yard, which was what Churchill had advocated for in the preceding months. The Nuremberg Trials did not end on October 1st, 1946. 12 subsequent proceedings, carried out between December 1946 and April 1949, tried 185 additional defendants in Nuremberg. Doctors who had performed experiments on prisoners, officials from the Einsatzgruppen, judges and prosecutors who had applied the justice of the Reich, industrialists who had utilized slave labor, high commands of the army, and officials from the ministries. Dr. Sigmund Rascher, responsible for the Dachau hypothermia experiments, was not tried in Nuremberg. Himmler had had him executed in Dachau itself in April 1945 due to internal disagreements. The irony of that specific death ran through several of the subsequent proceedings. Höss was executed in Poland on April 16, 1947, hanged on a gallows installed next to the house where he had lived with his family during his years as commander of Auschwitz, about 300 meters from the gas chambers. Eichmann was captured by the Mossad in Buenos Aires in 1960, tried in Jerusalem in 1961, and executed in 1962. Stryker had shouted references to the festival of Purim from the gallows. It was no accident that he did so. The story of Purim is the story of the defeat of Haman, the Persian official who planned the extermination of the Jews of his kingdom and ended up hanged on the very gallows he had built for one of his enemies. There is a category of damage that courts cannot process. Documents can establish how many died, testimonies can reconstruct how they died, judgments can determine who is legally responsible, but there is something that gets lost in translation into legal terms: the texture of individual terror, the specificity of the suffering of each person who passed through the systems that the tribunal judged. Major Ludwig Fluker, a German doctor and prisoner of war employed as a physician for the defendants, confided to Gilbert that what disturbed him most about the entire process was not the executions, but the moments when he saw the defendants become, briefly, ordinary people again. Goering playing with little Edda, his 8-year-old daughter, during family visits, Frank writing letters to his children, Sauckel asking with genuine concern if his family was being cared for. Gilbert, a trained psychologist, had arrived in Nuremberg expecting to find monsters in the clinical sense of the word. What he found was something more disturbing. Men who, under different conditions, could have been university professors, municipal officials, or corporate lawyers. Men to whom a political system had provided the instruments, the authorization, and the necessary ideological narrative to do what they did. The question with which Gilbert closed his final notes from Nuremberg, published in 1947 under the title Nuremberg Diary, was the same one that any reasonable person had been asking during the process. How was it possible? And the answer he had built from a year of night conversations in cells was not supernatural or monstrous. It was human, and for that reason it was more terrifying. The machinery of horror required obedience. It required the dehumanization of the other. It required that each link in the chain, from the bureaucrat who signed the form to the man who pulled the trigger or turned the gas valve, convince himself that what he was doing had some justification. And the Nazi apparatus had built, during 12 years of absolute power over information, education, culture, and law, a world in which those justifications existed. The High Command of the Wehrmacht had received an order in the autumn of 1941 stating that the captured Soviet soldier has lost his right to be treated as an honorable opponent. A German field marshal had added by hand in the margin, "I approve and back the measures." The tribunal found that field marshal guilty and executed him. But the question that the tribunal could not judge was what makes a human being write those words in a margin. And that question has no judgment. 8 months after the Nuremberg executions ended, in June 1947, the United Nations General Assembly entrusted the International Law Commission with the task of formulating the principles of international law recognized in the Charter and in the judgments of the tribunal. Those principles were formally approved in 1950. 5 decades later, when images of concentration camps in the former Yugoslavia began to circulate on news broadcasts around the world, the United Nations Security Council created an International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia on February 22, 1993. It was, in explicit and deliberate terms, the heir to the Nuremberg Tribunal. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda followed in 1994. The Permanent International Criminal Court followed, established by the Rome Statute of 1998, which entered into force in 2002. None of these courts has turned out to be sufficient. War crimes kept happening. Crimes against humanity kept happening. Massacres kept taking place in locations with names that the world learned first on the television news and then forgot. The dream of the founders of the Nuremberg process, that the establishment of individual responsibility for war crimes would act as a deterrent for future aggressors, was not fulfilled in the way they had hoped. But what did happen is that the language changed, that the category crime against humanity exists and has legal content thanks to what was done in room 600 of Nuremberg between November 1945 and October 1946. That the defense only obeying orders was formally rejected as a legal defense for the first time in history, and that has mattered in subsequent proceedings. And what also happened in the early morning of October 16, 1946, in a gymnasium of a ruined city in Bavaria, was that 11 men who had organized, ordered, and facilitated the death of tens of millions of people climbed the steps of 3 wooden platforms and answered, at least in that aspect, before something that could be called justice. One of them, the only one who found a way not to climb, did so with a crystal grain between his teeth. The tribunal had said, "This is a crime." History recorded this occurred. And between these two phrases, 90 years later, lives everything that remains of those who did not survive to testify.